Hello everyone, today we are going to come to a new topic. It is the mystery of the Holy Relic, the Crown of Thorns of Jesus. Let's find out together. In the dim light corridors of Notre-Dame de Paris, behind fortified glass and ancient leather quarries, rests an object shrouded in silence and mystery. A tangled ring of dry, thorn branches, were not by a monarch of goodly power, but by the plotted Son of Man as he marched to God Calvary. The crown of thorns, mockingly placed upon the head of Jesus Christ, has transcended its historical moment to become one of the most powerful and enigmatic relics in Christian history. At once an artifact, a theological metaphor, and symbol of divine suffering, it weaved together the paradoxes of glory and agony, kingship and humiliation, death and redemption. Unlike relics of worldly splendor, jewel crowns, golden swords, or opulent robes, the crown of thorns reflects a reign not of domination, but of sacrifice. The Gospel tells of Roman soldiers twisting together thorn branches to ridicule the claim that Jesus was King of the Jews, pressing the cruel crown onto his brow with mock homage. Yet, in their scorn, they unknowingly enacted a deeper truth, that in humiliation, Jesus revealed the true nature of divine kingship, a kingship that brought the sins of humanity in love, not beginnings. For centuries, believers and skeptics alike have grappled with the meaning of this relic. Is it truly the crown Christ wore? How did it survive the ravage of time, empire, war, and fire? Why has this simple bed of thorns inspired such reverence, controversy, and artistic expressions? This book embarks on a quest, not just through ancient texts and dusty walls, but through the heart of devotion, mystery, and sacred memory. We will travel from the pages of the New Testament to the golden altars, from imperial Byzantium to revolutionary Paris, from Vatican pronouncement to modern-day scientific labs. Along this path, we will encounter saints who wept at the side of the cross, skeptics who demanded evidence, and pilgrims whose knees have bent before it in silent awe. And the relic or representation, the crown of thorns speaks a language deeper than reason alone, a tone that still pierces the soul of humanity, urging us to confront suffering, love, and the cost of redemption. The story of the crown of thorns begins not in the lyric rows of cathedrals, but in the brutal final hours of Jesus Christ's earthly life, are recounted by the fourth canonical Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Among the instruments of his passion, the thorn crown holds a unique place as both a weapon of mockery and a symbol of profound theological irony. The Gospel offers varied but interlocking portrayals of this moment, illuminating not just as historical event, but a divine paradox, the King of Heaven crowned not in gold but in pain. In the Gospel of Matthew, the scene is vividly portrayed. After Jesus is condemned, Roman soldiers take him into the praetorium, stripping him of his garments and wrapping him in the scarlet robe, a parody of royal majesty. Then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him, mocking. The cruel humor of the scene is unmistakable. Every element, robe, sculpture, and crown, mimics royal failure, but in grotesque inversion. The thorns pierced not just his skin but his dignity, and the homage is exaggerated in sarcasm. Yet Matthew, writing to a primarily Jewish audience, intends the reader to see the fulfillment of prophecy. The true king is revealed not in splendor, but in suffering, echoing Isaiah's vision of the suffering servant, despised and rejected by man. Mark, often the most The text of the evangelist offers a nearly identical description. The soldiers clothed him in purple, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. Marked pravity does not lessen the impact. Rather, it highlights the stark brutality of the act. This account reflects a raw urgency, portraying Jesus as isolated, humiliated, and silently enduring the abuse. The crown here is not thus symbolic, it is an instrument of real torture. Blood would have flowed from his cup, mixing the sweat and dirt, compounding his physical torment as he prepared for crucifixion. Gospel of John adds a layer of theological reflection. John alone knows that Jesus wore the crown of thorns not only during the mocking, but when he was presented before the crowd by Pontius Pilate. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." In this moment, John offers a tableau that transcends politics. "Behold the man" becomes an internal declaration. This, the thorn-crowned figure, is the true image of divine humanity. For John, the irony is not the soldiers' mockery, but in the truth they knowingly proclaim, "Jesus is indeed king, but a king whose glory is hidden beneath suffering." The thorns means to ridiculed becomes his coronation. The Gospel of Luke notably does not mention the crown of thorns explicitly. However, his narrative includes the mocking of Jesus and the dressing in royal garments, implying similar crowns. Luke's emphasis is often on the innocence of Jesus and the unjust suffering he endures, which aligns with the themes of the thorn crown as a symbol of unjust pain in silence. Luke's omission of the crown may serve a literary function, allowing the other elements of mockery to stand in sharper contrast to Jesus' dignity and silence. Across these accounts, several consistent elements emerge. The crown is a Roman invention, not a Jewish one, crafted and embossed by soldiers trained in cruelty, political sarcasm. Its material composition is not specified in scripture, leaving literal tradition and relic researchers to speculate. The act is imparted in the broader framework of mockery and physical abuse, means to humiliate men accused of messianic pretensions. And yet, beneath this historical cruelty lies a profound theological statement. The true king was thorns, not gold. In Christian theology, the crown of thorns becomes not just a relic of torture, but a symbol of redemptive kingship. It prefigures the paradox of the cross, that glory is found in suffering and salvation in sacrifice. Later, Christian tradition would size up on this moment as one of cosmic significance. Church fathers such as Augustine and Origen pondered the deeper meaning of the thorn crown, linking it to the curse upon Adam and the reversal of that curse through Christ. The thorns in this reading are not just instruments of pain, but signs of fallen creation, now taken onto the head of the Redeemer. He does not merely suffer human injustice, he bears the very wounds of a broken world upon his brow. Thus, the biblical account of the crown of thorns offers more than a narrative tale. It provides the theological and emotional foundation upon which the veneration of the relic was later built. From this point forward, Christians would not only remember the passion of Christ, but also seek physical connections to it. And of all the instruments of the passion, the nails, the cross, and the lance, the crown of thorns holds a unique place, both intimately bodily and poignantly symbolic. It is not only seen as the crown he wore in his final hours, It is the crown he continues to wear in every generation that contemplates the mystery of a God who suffers. The crown of thorns, though physically brutal and historically imposed as an instrument of mockery, has become one of the most powerful and enduring theological symbols in honor of Christianity. Beyond the bloody scenes of Roman soldiers ridiculing or condemned men lies a profound spiritual mystery, the intertwining of kingship and suffering, sin and redemption, mockery and truth. This chapter delves deep into the symbolic and theological meanings attached to the crown of thorns, from early church interpretations to its mystical significance in contemplative spirituality, offering insight into why this relic evokes such reverence, devotion, and mysteries. At its core, the crown of thorns symbolizes the paradox of Christ's kingship. In the world's eyes, a crown is made of gold, adorned with gems, and signifies power, victory, and majesty. The crown that Jesus wore, by contrast, were made of thorns, real, painful, ugly, and cruel. And yet, within the Christian worldview, that very inversion becomes the key to divine kingship. It is a coronation not through domination, but through suffering. By accepting the thorns, Christ manifests a kingdom not of this world, one rooted in humility, sacrifice, and redemptive love. This paradox forms a bedrock of Christological theology, that the Son of God triumphed through apparent defeat, and that true glory is found not on imperial thrones, but in the bloody path of the cross. The thorns themselves carry deep biblical resonance, especially when viewed in the context of the fall of man in Genesis. After Adam and Eve sinned, God tells Adam, "Cursed in the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it. It will produce thorns and thistles for you." Thorns, in this light, are the visible signs of a cursed and fallen world. They represent pain, labor, sin, separation, and death. When Jesus wears the crown of thorns, he does not merely wear a throne of torture. He symbolically wears the curse of humanity. He placed upon his heart the burden of sin and the consequence of rebellion. In theological terms, that is a visible enactment of substitutionary atonement, the innocent bearing the marks of the guilty. This idea was not lost on the early church fathers. St. Augustine, in his writings, connects the thorns to the pain of sin and the torment of the conscience, which Christ bore in full. Origen saw the crown as a symbol of Christ's victory over spiritual powers, stating that military commanders receive crowns after triumph. Christ received the crown of thorns to signify his victory over death and evil. The thorns were not only a mark of mockery, but of divine intimacy. They drew blood from the Sacred Heart, representing both his human suffering and his readiness to redeem even the most bitter consequences of human sin. In medieval theology and mysticism, the crown of thorns becomes an object of intense devotional focus. Saints all receive visions or meditation center on the thorn crown, often depicting it as something they, too, wish to share in, to suffer alongside Christ. In this tradition, the thorns become not only wounds, but invitations, summons into the redemptive suffering of Christ. Mystical theology thus elevates the crown from a historical item into a spiritual reality, one that the faithful are called to contemplate and spiritually to wear. It becomes a symbol not just of Christ's passion, but of the Christian birth. Take up your cross and follow me, or in this case, take up your thorns. Theologically, the Crown of Thorns also reveals much about the nature of redemptive love. Unlike political rulers who used force to secure their reign, Christ allows himself to be crowned with pain. His sovereignty is revealed in suffering, his power in self-giving love. The thorns pierced, yes, but they also consecrate. In this light, some theologians refer to the thorn crowns as a reversed halo, mark of sanctity through pain rather than glory. Christ's divine heart is not surrounded by light, but by agony. However, both speak to his divinity. There is also a deeply Eucharistic dimension to be symbol. Thus, as the Eucharist makes Christ's body and blood present in sacramental form, the Crown of Thorns is a visual meditation on that same body, broken, and that same blood shed. Every thorn that pierced his scalp is a reminder of the cost of salvation. For medieval theologians and modern mystics alike, meditating on the crown is akin to kneeling at the foot of the cross. It invites union, repentance, awe, and thanksgiving. Finally, the Crown of Thorns serves as a symbol of spiritual warfare. In Christian tradition, thorns are often associated with temptation, sin, and demonic oppression. By allowing the thorns to pierce him, Christ metaphorically crushes the power of sin and evil. His acceptance of suffering becomes a divine act of defiance against Satan, who tempted him in the desert and watched his passion unfold. The thorn crown is thus a weapon as much as it is a gun, one that disarms the enemy not through violence but through love. In sum, the Crown of Thorns is not merely a historical artifact, not a grotesque reminder of Roman cruelty. It is, in Christian theology, a symbol of paradox, prophecy, and power. It speaks of a God who reigns from a cross, who wins to lost, who plays to blessed. Theologically, it links Genesis to Revelation, the throne to redemption, Adam to Christ. Spiritually, it calls each Christian to contemplate their own thorns, both those they bear and those they inflict. And in liturgy, art, and devotion, it continues to be one of the most compelling and mysterious symbols of the faith, a crown of mockery that became the true crown of the King of Kings. The story of the Crown of Thorns does not end at Calvary. While the Gospel records the cruel act of Roman soldiers placing the crown on Christ's head, the subsequent fate of the physical object, the very crown itself, unfolds as a fascinating journey that threads through centuries of history, devotion, war, and politics. The thread of the relic becomes part spiritual mystery, part historical inquiry. Now we will talk about the evolution of tradition and documentation surrounding the Crown of Thorns from the earliest days of Christianity to its emergence in Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christendom, by the early medieval period. Following the Crucifixion of Jesus, the Gospels remain silent about what became of the various instruments of his passion, the cross, the nails, the spear, and the crown of thorns. However, within a century or two, early Christian communities began developing traditions that certain holy objects had been preserved by witnesses or disciples. The growth of relic veneration in the 2nd or 3rd century coincided with the rise of pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and by the 4th century, especially following Emperor Constantine's conversion, there was a surge in interest in locating and venerating physical remains associated with Christ's Passion. Among the earliest and most famous relic discoveries was that of the true cross by Empress Helena, Constantine's mother. During her pilgrimage to Jerusalem around 326 AD. This event created an environment where other relics, real or legendary, would also begin to circulate and attract attention. The Crown of Thorns by this time had already begun to capture the imagination of Christian believers. Though silent on the crown itself, the Cumans Hellenes quest for pagan relics, while other early Christian writers began to make poetic or theological references to the thorns. However, the written documentation from the 4th century especially confirms the presence of the crown in Jerusalem. Unlike the cross, their relics of the Passion were revered and protected, often hidden to avoid desecration during times of persecution and wars. During the period, references to the crown began to appear more clearly in ecclesiastical records. The pilgrimage diaries of early Christian travelers to Jerusalem occasionally mention relics of the Passion being displayed, although not always naming them specifically. However, by the 6th century, the crown is increasingly cited in liturgical texts and homilies as part of the sacred treasures of the church. Church leaders emphasize the crown not only as a relic of Christ's suffering, but as a sacramental sign of divine kingship and redemptive victory. It was during this time that the imperial court began seeking to consolidate the holiest relics of Christendom within the Eastern Roman capital. As the political center of gravity shifted from Rome, so did the religious desire to possess and display sacred items as symbols of both divine favor and ecclesiastical authority. Over the course of the 6th and 7th century, relics traditionally linked to Jerusalem began to appear in Constantinople, either by imperial transfer, gifts from Eastern churches, or in some cases, during emergencies, evacuations due to invasions or unrest. The historical context of the 7th century was marked by increasing instability in the Holy Land. It's during that time that the Crown of Thorns may have been transported from Jerusalem to Constantinople, along with the other relics such as fragments of the true cross and the Holy Lance. Crown was reportedly housed in the chapel of the forest, a treasury of sacred relics within the imperial Great Palace, where it would remain for centuries as a symbol of both imperial legitimacy and divine protection. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Crown of Thorns had become a formal part of reliquary tradition. Liturgical calendars and orography mention the crown in Passion Week survived. Accounts from pilgrims and envoys describe the relic being likely displayed during Holy Week. The relic was no longer a hidden treasure. It was a public testimony to the continuity of Christian history, suffering to imperial glory. At this stage, however, the form of the relic begins to diverge in records. Some traditions speak of the full crown, others of its fragmented state. Branches separated, thorns removed and distributed as sacred gifts to churches and militaries across Christendom. This fragmentation was both an act of reverence and politics. Distributing thorns symbolized sharing in the Passion, but also served to summon alliances with Western rulers, ecclesiastical centers. These thorns began to circulate in Europe, paving the way for their eventual arrival in the West. The story of the Crown of Thorns movement reflects not only a theological continuity, but a complex tapestry of historical dynamics. Imperial ambition, ecclesiastical authority, war and exile, devotion and diplomacy. The crown, though unseen in the modern era until its Western arrival, was by the medieval period already cloaked in both historical memory and sacred mystery. Constantinople had become the new Jerusalem in the minds of Eastern Christians, and the Crown of Thorns stood as a potent symbol of that spiritual inheritance. The arrival of the Crown of Thorns in France marked a pivotal chapter not only in the journey of one of Christianity's most revered relics, but also in the history of European kingship, ecclesiastical authority, and medieval devotion. If Constantinople represented the Christian East, claimed to spiritual and imperial continuity with Jerusalem, then its transfer to Paris under King Louis of France as the new chosen kingdom of Christendom. Passage of the crown was more than a mere relocation of sacred matter. It was a carefully orchestrated confluence of faith, politics, and royal ambition that culminated in the enshrine of the relic in the very heart of medieval France. The journey of the Crown of Thorns to France began amidst the disintegration of the Byzantine Empire. By the early 13th century, Constantinople was in decline, weakened by internal strife and external threats. The Fourth Crusade, intended to reclaim Jerusalem, was disastrously redirected toward Constantinople, resulting in its sack and the establishment of the Latin Empire. The Latin Empire, desperate for funds and recognition from the West, began to starve of many treasures of the court, including precious relics. Among these was the Crown of Thorns, by then enshrined in the chapel of the Pharos, a highly revered relic believed to be the very crown placed on Christ's head during his passion. Enter King Louis, later canonized as Saint Louis, a ruler deeply devoted to the Catholic faith and eager to establish his kingdom as the foremost Christian realm. In 1238, the Latin Empire of Constantinople, facing bankruptcy and mounting pressure from both the Greeks and rival Latin states, offered the relic Louis Knight in exchange for financial and military support. For the enormous sums of 135,000, Louis acquired the crown, which was first delivered to Venice for safe custody, then ceremoniously escorted to France by royal agents. In August 1239, the crown arrived on French soil. Louis Knight, in the gesture of extreme humility and piety, personally carried the relic barefoot and clothed in a simple tunic through the streets of Saints, and later perished, accompanied by bishops, nobles, and crowds of the faithful. The arrival of the crown was a moment of national exaltation, symbolizing not only France's divine favor, but Louis' rose as a new Constantine, a monarch who ruled with Christ at the center of his authority. This public act of royal devotion was carefully choreographed to elevate both the spiritual and political status of the dynasty. Initially, the crown was deposited within Notre-Dame Cathedral, where it was placed on the high altar for public veneration. Notre-Dame, already the spiritual heart of Paris, now became the guardian of one of the most sacred objects of Christendom. Special masses, processions, and vigils were instituted to honor the relic, and its presence drew pilgrims from across Europe. The cathedral was transformed into a site not merely of worship, but of national identity, a fusion of architecture, liturgy, and relic that made Paris the nexus of sacred kingship and divine relics. However, Louis Knight had an even greater vision. He commissioned the construction of the Palatine Temple within the royal palace complex, a structure that would rival any sacred building in Europe in beauty and purpose. Completed in 1248, Saint Chapel was built specifically to house the Crown of Thorns, along with the other Pagan relics Louis had acquired, including pieces of the two crosses and the Holy Lance. The translation of the relic from Notre-Dame to Center Chapel was accompanied by intricate ceremonies that reinforced the unity of church and ground. Inside the radiant upper chapel, flooded with color light from its towering stained glass windows, the crown was enshrined in a golden reliquary, visible during feasts and royal occasions. The reliquary itself became an object of devotion, decorated with gems and inscriptions glorifying the Passion of Christ and the divine right of the French king. Louis IX's association with the crown was so strong that his canonization in 1297 further sanctified the relic's place in French consciousness. For medieval France, to venerate the crown was to affirm that sacredness of the monarchy. Throughout the late Middle Ages, the Crown of Thorns remained central to France's religious and political identity. Monarchs would venerate it during coronations and crises, and its presence was invoked during plague, war, and reform. In 1306, Philip IV processed through Paris with the crown during a time of civic unrest, using it to adjust divine legitimacy. Meanwhile, the liturgy of Holy Week in Paris came to revolve around the Passion relics housed in Center Chapel, drawing the faithful into a deeply mystical contemplation of Christ's suffering. Even as theological disputes and schisms erupted in later centuries, the crown continued to be a source of unity and mystery, despite concerns about authenticity that would arise in later modernity. During the medieval period, there was no doubt among clergy and laity that this was the genuine Crown of Thorns. Its thorns, some removed and distributed to churches in Europe, were treated with reverence, often encased in crystal and gold. Its thorns were thought to retain the sacramental power of the whole, making the relic not only a historical object but a spiritual conduit to the Passion. In sum, the arrival of the Crown of Thorns in France under St. Louis was a sad moment in the history of relics and royal piety. It marked the culmination of a relic's journey from the agony of Golgotha to the heart of Christendom's most powerful monarchy. Through its enshrinement at Notre-Dame and Center Chapel, the crown became not just a witness to Christ's suffering, but a living symbol of France's divine mission. Its presence brought together threads of theology, kingship, architecture, and devotion, solidifying France's claim as a chosen realm, the new guardian of sacred memory. The serenity that surrounded the Crown of Thorns within the Gothic splendor of Center Chapel did not last forever. As France transitions from the medieval era into the modern age, the relic, once the epitome of royal sanctity and Christian devotion, found itself caught in the throes of profound social, political, and ideological upheavals. From the devastation of the 100 Years' War to the iconoclastic zeal of the French Revolution, the Crown of Thorns became a silent witness to centuries of turmoil, surviving destruction, theft, and neglect while retaining its mystical significance. The first major threat to the relic's security emerged during the 100 Years' War. From 1337 to 1453, a protracted conflict between England and France that ravaged the countryside, stabilized the monarchy, and endangered sacred institutions. Although the crown remained protected in Paris, the violence that spread across the kingdom led to concerns about the safety of such revered objects. The monarch and clergy, ever mindful of the relic's symbolic value, instead that it was guarded during periods of occupation and unrest. Nonetheless, the war marked a turning point. France, once seen as the uncontested defender of the relic, now faced internal and external forces that threatened its sacred heritage. Subsequent conflict, including the wars of religions, proved even more perilous. This violent clash between French Catholic and Protestant left churches looted, relics destroyed, and clergy murdered. The Crown of Thorns, closely associated with Catholic royal authority, became a potential target for iconoclastic rage. The monarchy took measures to show it, reaffirming its position as not only a holy object but also a bulwark of Catholic identity. During these years, the relic was seldom displayed, kept out of public view to protect it from both physical harm and theological challenge. The notion of relic veneration itself came under attack by Protestant reformers. However, for Catholic France, the crown stood as a vibrant symbol of continuity with Christ and the early church. As France moved into the Enlightenment era, a more insidious threat arose, not from religious violence, but from philosophical skepticism and rationalism. The Crown of Thorns, like other relics, began to be scrutinized through the lens of scientific inquiry and historical criticism. Enlightenment thinkers, inspired by reason and empirical observation, questioned the authenticity of such objects, regarding them as medieval superstitions perpetuated by ecclesiastical power structures. This intellectual shift gradually eroded public reverence for relic, replacing sacred awe with doubt and derision. However, the relic remained officially protected, if not publicly celebrated. Through the 20th century, the Crown of Thorns survived two world wars, both of which once again threatened the safety of France's religious heritage. During World War II, efforts were made to protect the relic from Nazi looting or destruction, and it was temporarily moved to secure locations. Its conflict underscored the vulnerability of sacred relics in a world increasingly dominated by secular ideologies and total warfare. That the crown endured, carried forward not by the sword or crowd, but by those who saw in it a living thread that connected modern France with the suffering and redemption for Christ. In all these centuries of turbulence, wars, reforms, revolutions, and ideologies, the Crown of Thorns remained a resilient relic, preserved not only by the devotion of the faithful, but also by unexpected actors, secular scholars, revolutionary bureaucrats, and even enemies of religion, who nonetheless recognize its unparalleled significance. It became more than a devotional object, it became a survivor, a paradoxical relic in a post-relic world, bearing witness to humanity's capacity both to destroy and to preserve, to doubt and to believe. In the modern era, where empirical evidence and scientific verification dominate intellectual discourse, even sacred relics must undergo the scrutiny of laboratory instruments and critical inquiry. The Crown of Thorns, venerated by millions over the centuries, has become the subject of numerous attempts to ascertain its authenticity. Though faith alone sufficed in the past, the rise of historical criticism, archaeology, and modern science has compelled religious authorities, secular researchers alike, to examine whether this revealed object is indeed the very crown placed upon Jesus' head during his passion. The search for certainty has yield insight, but also deepened the mysteries. One of the primary challenges in authenticating the Crown of Thorns lies in its fragmented state. What exists today in the cathedral treasury, formerly housed in Notre-Dame the Paris, is not a complete circular crown, but a printed circlet made of rushes, approximately 21 centimeters in diameter, without any thorns attached. According to church tradition, the original crown was composed of a thorny plant, but the actual thorns have been separated over time, often distributed as relics to monarchs, cathedrals, and abbeys throughout Christendom. Over 70 reputed thorns exist in various locations, making the task of identifying the original component extremely difficult. To address this complexity, researchers have attempted to identify the botanical species of the crown and its thorns. Various theories suggest plants native to the region of Judah may have been used in crafting the original crown. However, the existing printed circlet in Paris is made not of thorny material. Some have interpreted this as evidence that the surviving crown is merely a supportive base to which the thorns were once attached. Others have suggested the possibility of a later medieval fabrication or replacement for preservation purposes. Modern radiocarbon dating has not yet been definitively applied to the Paris circlet, largely due to church concerns about damaging the relic and the reverence surrounding it. However, some tests were performed on detected thorns held in other relic collections during medieval era results, typically between the 7th and 10th century AD. These findings, while inconclusive regarding the crown's origin at Golgotha, suggest that the thorns may have been incorporated into Christian veneration practices during the early period. Skeptics argued that this disconnect between the traditional date of Jesus' crucifixion and the dating of the relics point to a legendary rather than literal origin. Beyond material analysis, historical studies have sought to trace the journey of the crown through textual and artistic records. Manuscripts, royal inventories, and pilgrimage accounts from Constantinople and medieval France support the relic's prominence as early as the 4th century. The crown is mentioned in several pilgrimage guides and is depicted in illuminated manuscripts. The historical continuity of veneration is well attested, even if the physical evidence remains less conclusive. Some of the most detailed modern investigations have come from French scholars and ecclesiastical custodians, especially following its transfer to Notre-Dame. In 1896, a respected French historian and theologian published a multi-volume critical study on the crown, carefully examining its provenance, construction, and presence in historical sources. He concluded that while absolute proof of identity with the original crown of Christ is beyond doubt, the continuity of devotion and unchallenged historical custody give the relic plausible legitimacy. More recently, theologians and scientists affiliated with the Vatican to the College of France have urged further studies to evaluate relics like the crown through both scientific and devotional lenses. Technological advancements have opened the possibility for non-invasive imaging to analyze the composition to the relic's materials without inflicting damage. These tools, combined with high-resolution microscopy, could potentially confirm whether the circular components were manipulated by ancient or medieval tombs, or whether organic residues from thorny stones once adorned it. However, such studies require permissions from church authorities, who remain cautious about exposing the relic. Secular experimentation that might be seen as reducing the sacred to the merely material. An intriguing era of research concerns the distribution of thorn relics and how they relate to the parish circlet, and the many thorns in European churches, authentic parts of the original, or were they created as devotional surrogates. In some cases, thorn relics have been carbon dated, when others were embedded into reliquaries with inscriptions that trace them to royal donations or crusader gifts. The Vatican itself hosts one such thorn displayed in a chapel near St. Peter. While some studies suggest medieval origin, the symbolic meaning of these objects continues to overshadow debates about their origins. Despite these scientific endeavors, certainty remains elusive. The Crown of Thorns occupies a realm where historical fact, sacred tradition, and human longing intersect. The lack of proof has not diminished its spiritual significance. Rather, the mystery enhances its aura. For believers, the relic represents not merely a physical object, but a tangible link to the person of Christ, a symbol of suffering, sacrifice, and divine love. For historians and scientists, it is an enigma worth pursuing, a fragment of the past that invites questions about the nature of truth, faith, and evidence. Ultimately, the study of the Crown of Thorns reveals as much about the modern mindset as it does about the relic itself. It reflects the tension between the rational and the mystical, the need for verification and the endurance of belief. Whether or not science can ever prove its origin at Golgotha, the relic's survival through centuries of war, doubt, and devotion speak to something deeper, a continuity of sacred memory that transcends times and testing. Throughout Christian history, the Crown of Thorns has been far more than a physical relic enshrined in cathedrals or still in guided reliquaries. It has been a spiritual beacon, drawing saints, mystics, and common faithful into the profound mysteries of Christ's suffering. From the deserts of early monasticism to the cloister of medieval abbeys and the ecstatic visions of Baroque mystics, the relic of the Crown has inspired a vast tradition of devotion, penance, and contemplative love. Its thorns, symbolic of sin and sacrifice, pierce not only the pearl of Christ, but also the hearts of those who dared to contemplate his passion with depth and sincerity. In the early centuries, devotion to the Passion was primarily expressed in the liturgical circle of Holy Week and in the life of the Desert Fathers, who saw Christ's suffering as a model for their ascetic path. However, it was not until the medieval period, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries, that the Crown of Thorns became a central image in the personal piety of Christians. This coincided with the flourishing of affective mysticism, in which believers sought an emotional and often physical identification with Christ's sufferings. Figures like a Cistercian abbot, deeply devoted to the humanity of Christ, preached sermons that encouraged meditating on the cross as a gateway to humility and love. In his writings, he frequently spoke of wounds of love and the crown of humility, linking Christ's suffering with the soul's purification. The devotion reached new heights during the time of Saint Louis, Knight of France, who not only acquired the relic in the 13th century, but also modeled his kingship on the suffering Christ. For Louis, wearing a crown of thorns signified divine kingship through humility, a motif that reappeared frequently in mystical literature. The king himself was known to fast rigorously, watch the feast of lepers, and meditate in silence before the crowd, which he housed in the magnificent center chapel, a chapel that itself became a testament to mystical beauty and spiritual transcendence. In the later Middle Age, mystics received visions of Christ crowned with thorns, often accompanied by divine revelations of his love for humanity. This vision described the crown as radiating both pain and light, pointing the soul to the crucified Savior. Saint Catherine described in her mystical writings how she offered her life in union with Christ's suffering, bearing the invisible crown of spiritual thorns as a sign of intercessory sacrifice for the church. Saint Bridget of Sweden, through her extensive revelation known as the Revelation of Saint Bridget, claimed to have seen the Passion unfold, where Jesus expressed that each thorn caused unpredictable agony, but also immense mercy poured out of sinners. The Carmelite mystics, while not directly focused on the relic, carry the legacy of the thorns in their understanding of the dark night of the soul, where suffering and purification are necessary for union with God. The crown of thorns were often understood symbolically as the purification of the mind, the spiritual battle against pride, and the call to unite into real pain with Christ's redemptive sacrifice. During the Baroque era, when devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus surged in popularity, the crown of thorns became one of the most prominent symbols encircling the flaming heart, representing not only suffering but also divine love wounded by sin. Saint Margaret Mary, the visionary nun who promoted the devotion to the Sacred Heart, often saw Christ's heart surrounded by the crowd, calling the faithful to offer their own life in reparation for the offenses against God's love. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a renewed wave of mystical devotion, particularly among stigmatic individuals believed to physically bear the wounds of Christ. Many of them reported mystical experiences involving the crown. In particular, Emmerich provided vivid visions of the Passion, in which she saw the cruel coronation of Christ, often in harrowing detail. Her descriptions would later influence religious art and films, such as The Passion of the Christ. Beyond the mystics, popular devotions, including the Stations of the Cross, the Sorrowful Mysteries of the Rosary, and the Litany of the Passion, all bear traces of the crown's spiritual power. The image of the crowned Christ, silent yet sovereign, involves both judgment and mercy, inviting believers into a profound union with the suffering Savior. The relic, whether present physically or contemplated spiritually, continues to shape how generations of Christians understand the products of the cross. That through pain, redemption is born. In the contemporary church, especially during Lenten devotion, the crown of thorns remains a central motif of contemplation. Art, poetry, and music echo its theme, often blending ancient symbolism with modern appeals for peace, humility, and healing. The relic has thus transcended time, not only preserved in gold and crystal, but etched into the collective spiritual memory of the Church. It reminds believers that divine kingship is crowned not with jewels but with thorns, not with glory but with sacrifice, not with domination but with love. The crown of thorns, with its piercing symbolism and tragic beauty, has left a profound imprint on the visual and cultural imagination of humanity. Far beyond the reliquaries of cathedrals and the pages of sacred scripture, it has become a universal icon of suffering, sacrifice, and redemption, permitting every artistic medium, from early Christian mosaic to Renaissance masterpieces, From Gothic hymns to modern cinema, across centuries and continents, artists and thinkers have grappled with its form and meaning, creating a rich cultural tapestry that reflects both the honor of human cruelty and the hope of divine mercy. In visual art, the Crown of Thorns emerged gradually as a distinctive motif. Early Christians emphasized that victorious Christ, often avoiding direct depictions of the Passion, but with the rise of Western medieval spirituality, especially during the 12th and 13th centuries, the image of the suffering Christ wearing the crown became increasingly prominent. Illuminated manuscripts, altarpieces, and frescoes began to portray the behold man, Christ mocked and crowned by soldiers, clothed in purple and presented to the crown. These images were not those theological, they were emotional, drawing the viewer into the agony of the Savior. The Gothic period saw the flourishing of this devotional art, with sculptors and painters depicting the moment of coronation with vivid realism. The Renaissance, with its renewed interest in human emotion and anatomy, elevated the crown's depiction to new artistic heights. Masters portrayed the mock Christ in scenes that combine psychological depth with spiritual gravity. The Baroque period followed with artists whose dynamic composition and rich colors further deepened the narrative. The crown is not merely an accessory, but a symbol of transcendent sorrow, lifting the scenes beyond time. In architecture and sacred design, the crown inspired literal and symbolic interpretations. The Center Chapel in Paris, commissioned by St. Louis Knight to house the relic, was constructed as a jewel reliquary itself. Its drawing stained glass windows and interior light reflect the inner beauty of redemptive suffering. The Gothic spires and rose windows of cathedrals often echo the crown's circular form, thorns transmuted into light and color. Even modern judges have used the motif of thorns in structural forms and decorative carvings, linking sacred space to the mystery of the Passion. Literature, too, has embraced the crown's symbolism. From medieval mystery plays to 20th century poetry, the thorns have represented not only Christ's suffering, but the suffering of the world. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, does not mention the crown directly, but constructs a world in which divine justice and human repentance are filtered through suffering. Later, John, the metaphysical poet, meditated on the Passion in his sermons and poems, envisioning the crown as a paradox, an object of mockery that becomes a sign of internal royalty. In modern times, as Wednesday and four quarters echo the imagery of brokenness, crown and thorns to speak of spiritual trial and redemption in a post-world world. Music, both liturgical and classical, has also drawn upon the crown's imagery. In St. Matthew's Passion, the choice laments over the mockery of Christ are interwoven with references to the crown, expressing deep grief and awe. In the modern era, composers have captured the sorrowful mystery of the crown in their minimalist and spiritual compositions. The chant traditions of the Church, especially in the service of Holy Week, use poetic language to recall the crown as a sign of divine silence and redemptive pain. In film and media, the Crown of Thorns has emerged as a powerful visual shorthand for Christ's suffering. Perhaps most famously, Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ in 2004 portrayed the crowning in extreme detail, drawing from mystic to convey not only the brutality but the dignity of Christ in suffering. The crown has even appeared symbolically in secular works, used to evoke martyrdom, sacrifice, and critique of power, demonstrating its depth integration into the Western cultural cycle. In popular culture, the Crown of Thorns occasionally appears in fiction, tattoos, and contemporary visual art. Not always reverently, but often as a symbol of rebellion, pain, and misunderstood strength. Musicians, especially in rock and metal genres, have invoked its image in lyrics and album art. The use may seem irreverent, but it underscores the enduring cultural relevance of the symbol, which retains the power to provoke, to mute, and to challenge. Ultimately, the Crown of Thorns is a symbol that transcends time, medium, and intention. It is at once a relic, a mystery, a urn, and a crown. Whether rendered in gold leaf on a cathedral dome or scratched in charcoal on a prison wall, its thorns continue to speak of a love that implies suffering so that the world might be redeemed. In every brushstroke, lyric, control, and verse, it whispers the same truth, that glory comes not through domination, but through sacrifice, and that true kingship is revealed through a pierced brow and a heart laid bare. The veneration of relics, especially those directly linked to the Passion of Christ, such as the Crown of Thorns, remains one of the most enduring and emotionally powerful expressions of Christian devotion. While relic worship in the medieval period was characterized by grand processions, physical proximity, and elaborate liturgy, the modern world, with its increased secularization, technological advancement, and globalization, has redefined how pilgrims and devotees engage with holy objects. However, rather than diminishing its spiritual resonance, these shifts have allowed the devotion to the Crown of Thorns to evolve, adapt, and even expand across continents and cultures. Pilgrimage in the traditional sense, a journey to a sacred site for spiritual enrichment, continues to draw thousands each year to Paris, where the Crown of Thorns is kept at the Notre-Dame Cathedral. Despite the devastating fire in 2019, which caused immense damage to the cathedral, the crown was miraculously saved and remains an object of deep veneration. In the months and years following the fire, faithful from all over the world expressed solidarity and sorrow, showing how emotionally and spiritually tied they were to this relic. Seeing the cathedrals closer to the public, temporarily exhibitions and controlled viewings of the crown in the Louvre and other religious institutions have become forms of pilgrimage in transition, proving that modern mobility does not prevent spiritual longing. In the modern age of global travel, pilgrimage is no longer bound by medieval constraints of geography and hardship. Devotees from Africa, Asia, the Americas now visit Europe with relative ease, and the Crown of Thorns has become a focal point of Christian tourism. Two agencies offer sacred flight packages, incorporating the crown among stops like Lourdes and Cajas. In a postmodern context where religious identity is sometimes intertwined with cultural curiosity, many secular tourists also find themselves emotionally moved when encountering the crown, even if their pilgrimage is accidental rather than intentional. This duality of purpose, faithful devotion, and spiritual curiosity reflects the dynamic nature of relic worship today. Digital pilgrimage and virtual worship have expanded dramatically, particularly during global crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. With physical access restricted, cathedrals and religious institutions live stream viewings of the Crown during Holy Week, allowing millions to participate in veneration from their homes. The shift to digital platforms introduced a new theology of presence, one not limited by physical proximity, but still imbued with spiritual intimacy. Social media platforms such as Instagram, YouTube, or Facebook have become unexpected authors for sharing prayers, testimonials, and reflections on the Passion. Virtual pilgrimages have emerged with high-resolution 3D tours of Notre-Dame, immersive VR experiences of the Holy Week in Turkey, and apps that lead users in meditative prayers focusing on the Crown of Thorns. For many younger Christians, this form of worship has become no less meaningful than standing physically in front of the relic itself. Theology in the modern age must grapple with this shift. Some traditionalist theologians caution against the dilution of the sacramental experiences through screens, emphasizing the incarnational nature of Christian worship. Others, however, celebrate the democratization of access, noting that the Holy Spirit transcends time, space, and even pixels. The veneration of relics, including the crown, has become an expression of universal unity, a shared longing across borders, language, and denominations. Ecumenical and interfaith perspectives have also shaped the way the crown is perceived in the modern world. While relic veneration has traditionally been more prominent in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, there is a growing openness among Protestant communities to engage with such sacred symbols, not for intercession, but as tangible reminders of the suffering and sacrifice of Christ. In interfaith dialogue, the crown is sometimes declared not for worship, but as a symbol of unjust suffering shared across religious traditions. Jewish, Muslim, and even Buddhist leaders have commented on the emotional and moral power of the crown, not as dogma, but as a symbol of human agony and divine endurance. The role of the crown in social and political movements also cannot be ignored. In regions plagued by persecution, poverty, and war, believers often turn to the image of the crown as a source of strength and hope. In Latin America, where liberation theology has taken deep root, the suffering Christ crowned with thorns is seen as a companion of the oppressed. In Africa, the image of the thorn-crowned Christ is used in sermons and iconography as a sign of solidarity with those who suffer from hunger, conflict, and injustice. Across Asia, particularly in the Philippines and South Korea, Holy Week processions involving crown replicas continue to draw millions, blending local control with global Catholic tradition. Meanwhile, the commercialization of pilgrimage poses both challenges and opportunities. Religious souvenirs, mass-produced relic replicas, and tourism-related industries often risk trivializing what is sacred. However, when approached with reverence and proper catechism, these material objects can become gateways to deeper contemplation. Small replicas of the crown, whereas neglected or displayed in homes, serve as personal altars, prompting private prayer and silent reflection. In recent decades, Catholic youth movements such as World Youth Day have reintroduced Passion relics, including the crown, into global consciousness. When images or relic fragments are present at these gatherings, they ignite a renewed fervor among young believers. The crown, in such context, is not merely a museum piece. It becomes a spiritual challenge, calling the next generation to bear witness to Christ's true love, humility, and endurance. In sum, the modern world, far from weakening the cult of the crown, has re-imaged it, whether through online devotion, international pilgrimage, liturgical commemorations, or quiet contemplation before a screen. The worship of the Crown of Thorns continues. It proved that no matter the era or medium, the mystery of redemptive suffering and divine love will always draw the human heart. In our age of destruction, the crown remains a thorny but radiant reminder that even amid brokenness or chaos, the suffering of Christ still binds heaven and earth. The Crown of Thorns is not merely an archaeological artifact or a devotional relic. It is a mystery unfolded in paradoxes, woven from mockery but crowned in majesty, soaked in blood yet radiating glory. This relic speaks across millennia, not only to intellect but to the soul. In the intertwined strands of thorn and flesh, we encounter the fullness of the Christian mystery. That suffering is not meaningless, that true kingship is marked by humility, and that redemption flows not from power but from sacrifice. Now we come to a contemplative reflection on these three dimensions: suffering, kingship, and redemption, illuminated by the Crown of Thorns. Suffering is the first and most visceral message of the crown. Unlike other symbols of Christian suffering, the cross, the scourge, the nails, the crown touches the heart, the seat of thought, reason, identity, and consciousness. In the Passion narrative, the thorns pierce not just the skin, but the dignity of Jesus, turning the symbol of royal triumph into a tune of humiliation. Yet, herein lies its mystery. Christ, the innocent one, does not reject this mockery but receives it silently, transforming pain into purpose. The crown becomes a mirror in which the human condition is reflected. Our wounds, our humiliations, our betrayals. In embracing the thorns, Jesus unites himself with all those who suffer unjustly, the poor, the sick, the persecuted, and the forgotten. He wears the pain like a crown, not to glorify suffering itself, but to transfigure it into a path toward divine union. For the Christian, the crown becomes a crown, not to seek suffering, but to enter it with the same love, dignity, and redemptive hope as Christ. Kingship, in light of the Crown of Thorns, is ratified. The world crowns with gold, God crowns with thorns. The mock coronation in the Gospel of John complete the purple robe with sculpture and jeering soldiers, ironically reveals a truth deeper than the mocker intended. Christ is a king, but not by the standards of empire. He is not a kingdom of coercion or domination, but of love, justice, and mercy. The thorns are not a denial of his royalty, but its very affirmation. In Christian theology, this moment fulfills the messianic expectation of a shepherd king who rules not by force, but by laying down his life for his sheep. The crown challenges every earthly notion of leadership and power, calling those in authority to lead by service, to wear our symbolic crowns of humility and sacrifice. For believers, its reoriented ambition, greatness lies not in lording over others, but in washing their feet, in suffering for their sake. Redemption is the final and ultimate meaning of the crown. Every thorn pressed into the flesh of Christ becomes a sign of the healing that his passion brings to humanity. The book of Genesis describes thorns as a curse of the fall, a symbol of sin's consequence on creation. Therefore, in wearing a crown of thorns, Christ takes up on himself not only human suffering, but the very cost of sin itself. He washed the brokenness of the world and transformed it. Redemption is not merely forgiveness of sin, it is the renewal of all things. The thorns of the throne become the blossom of salvation. The mocking coronation is reversed into the instrument of the risen Lord, and the crown that once tore flesh becomes the emblem of divine victory. Every Good Friday bears the seed of Easter Sunday. Every cross has its crown, and every wound is resurrection. The crown of thorns is not an end, but a passage, not a defeat, but a beginning. Ultimately, the reflections provoked by the crown are deeply personal. Each person bears their own invisible thorns, griefs, traumas, unjustice, and regrets. In contemplating the crown of Christ, the Christian is invited to see their pain in a new light, not erased, but embraced by the one who suffered out of love. The crown becomes not only Christ, but ours as well, not as a burden to crush us, but as a sign that we are never alone in suffering. Together it is to be conformed to Christ, not in appearance, but in love. That is the paradox at the heart of Christian faith, that out of the most brutal symbols of human cruelty emerges the most radiant symbol of divine love. The crown of thorns has never been merely a relic locked behind glass and encased in gold. It remains, symbolically and spiritually, a living thorn embedded in the collective soul of humanity. Though 2 millennia have passed since it was thrust onto the head of Christ, its sting still echoes in every cry of injustice, every act of cruelty, every face marked by suffering. This epilogue is not simply a closure to historical or theological inquiry, but a solemn meditation on the enduring relevance of the crown, a thorn that continues to pierce the conscience of the world and the hearts of those who dare to see. In a world intoxicated with power, wealth, and pride, the crown of thorns remains a scandal. It contradicts every timeless narrative. It refuses to be sanitized or romanticized. It whispers the truth that redemption comes not through conquest, but through sacrifice, not by avoiding pain, but by transforming it. The image of the thorn-crowned Christ stands as an internal rebuke to empire and oppression, to vanity and comfort. It reveals how human hands still wave crowns of mockery against the poor, the weak, and the outsider. The crown is not a relic of the past, it is a mirror held to the present. And yet, paradoxically, the thorn does not only wound, it awakens. In every century, mystics, saints, artists, and ordinary believers have encountered in this relic a call to compassion, to humility, and to courageous love. The crown has crowned martyrs and missionaries, poets and popes, prisoners and prophets. It has inspired acts of radical forgiveness, self-giving, and hope amidst despair. To meditate upon it is to confront not only the suffering of Christ, but the suffering of the world, and to hear the gentle voice that says, "What you do for the least of these, you do for me." In a time when thorns once again encircle the globe, wars that tear nations apart, ideologies that divide us, wounds inflicted by greed and indifference, the crown invites us to choose a different way. Not the path of mock kingship, but of servant love. Not the glory of thrones, but the grace of thorns. In its silent, persistent dignity, it continues to proclaim a gospel that conforts the proud and comforts the broken. So let the crown of thorns not rest in silence. Let it continue to speak, to act, to burn like fire in the soul of the church and the world. Its sharp points prod us out of complacency, and its woven circle reminds us that no pain is forgotten, no love is wasted, and no doubt is final. For this thorn, once pressed into the heart of the crucified, has become a seed planted in history, and from its blossoms the mystery of God's kingdom, where love reigns, suffering is redeemed, and every tear is wiped away. The thorn still pierced, but it also